I escaped a religious cult community at 18, but I lost my family in the process. I'm not sure how to start this, but I guess I'll just dive in. My name's Adam, and I'm 27. I was born into a place most people have never heard of, Gloriavale. It's an isolated Christian community in New Zealand, but honestly, calling it a community is giving it too much credit. It was more of a cult, controlled by a handful of leaders who dictated every aspect of our lives. We were cut off from the outside world, fed strict religious teachings, and punished if we ever questioned anything. I spent the first 18 years of my life in that place, and it wasn't until I escaped that I realized just how much damage it had done to me. Growing up in Gloriavale was strange. When you're a kid, you don't question much because it's all you know. It felt normal to have the leaders of the community decide everything for you: what you wore, who you talked to, what you were allowed to believe. Every day was the same. We'd wake up, go to prayer meetings, work or attend lessons, and then go back to prayer. Everything revolved around their version of Christianity, and any outside influence was seen as sinful. We were told the outside world was full of evil, that people out there were immoral, corrupt, and headed straight for hell. It wasn't just fear, it was drilled into us from birth that we were the only ones who could be saved. For the first few years of my life, I believed it. How could I not? I didn't know anything else. But as I got older, things started to feel off. I remember being around 12 when I started noticing how harsh the leaders were, how they'd punish people for the smallest things. If you asked the wrong question or didn't show enough enthusiasm during prayer, they'd single you out. The punishments ranged from physical beatings to public humiliation, where they'd call you out in front of the entire community. I saw adults break down in tears, completely destroyed by the leaders' words and actions. By the time I was 16, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was very wrong. I started questioning things in my head, wondering why we had to follow such strict rules, why everything outside Gloriavale was seen as evil. But questioning wasn't allowed. If the leaders suspected that you were doubting their teachings, they'd come down on you hard. They'd call it discipline, but really, it was abuse. I saw people get beaten for simply speaking out of turn, and the mental torment was just as bad. They'd tell you that you were worthless without Gloriavale, that if you left, you'd burn in hell for eternity. I tried to suppress those thoughts for as long as I could. After all, my family was still there. My parents, my siblings, everyone I cared about. Leaving wasn't just about escaping Gloriavale. It meant leaving them behind too, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to do that. But every day, the tension grew. I'd see things that made my stomach turn, like how the leaders treated women and children like property, or how they forced people into marriages without their consent. It was all about control. Things got worse when I turned 18. By then, I had started to openly resist some of the rules. I wasn't blatantly rebellious, but I stopped pretending that I was okay with everything. I kept to myself more, avoided the leaders, and tried to stay out of trouble. But that wasn't enough. The leaders had eyes everywhere, and they quickly noticed that I wasn't falling in line like I used to. They started targeting me, calling me out in meetings, accusing me of being sinful and rebellious. I remember one night, after a particularly brutal public shaming, they dragged me into a room and beat me for what felt like hours. They told me it was for my own good, that they were saving me. But all I felt was pain and anger. That was the moment I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay there any longer, not if I wanted to survive. The abuse, the control, the constant fear, it was suffocating. But leaving wasn't as simple as just walking out the door. Gloriavale was isolated, and they kept a close watch on everyone. If you left without permission, they'd come after you. And even if I did manage to escape, where would I go? I had no formal education, no money, no idea how the outside world worked. Everything I had been taught told me that the outside world was dangerous, that I'd be lost without Gloriavale. But I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I remember the night I escaped like it was yesterday. I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents, not my siblings, no one. I couldn't risk it. If they knew, they might try to stop me, or, worse, report me to the leaders. I waited until everyone was asleep, packed a small bag with whatever I could carry, and slipped out into the dark. My heart was pounding the entire time. I knew that if I got caught, the punishment would be severe, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get as far away from Gloriavale as possible. I walked for hours, stumbling through the dark, not even sure if I was going in the right direction. There were no streetlights, no signs, nothing but empty fields and forests. I was terrified. I kept imagining that one of the leaders would appear out of nowhere, drag me back, and make an example out of me in front of the whole community. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Eventually, I made it to a small town. It wasn't much, just a few houses and a gas station, but to me, it felt like freedom. I didn't know anyone, and I had no money, but I didn't care. I was out. I was free. Or at least, that's what I thought. The reality of being free hit me hard, though. I had escaped Gloriavale, but now what? I had no plan, no skills, and no idea how to survive in the real world. For the first few weeks, I slept wherever I could, on park benches, in alleyways, sometimes in a church if they'd let me. I didn't know where to go or who to turn to. The outside world was overwhelming. Everything moved so fast, and I didn't understand how anything worked. People seemed to have their own lives, their own routines, and I didn't fit in anywhere. I started wondering if I had made a mistake. Maybe the leaders were right. Maybe the outside world really was as dangerous and unforgiving as they said. There were nights when I thought about going back, about begging for forgiveness and rejoining my family, but every time that thought crossed my mind, I remembered the abuse, the fear, the control. I couldn't go back to that. I wouldn't. Update. After weeks of wandering and surviving on scraps, the reality of being homeless really set in. It's one thing to think about freedom in the abstract, but it's entirely different when you're living it with no plan, no direction, and no support. Each day became a struggle to find food, to stay warm, and to avoid dangerous situations. I was a walking ghost, drifting from one park bench to another, trying to stay invisible. It felt like the world was moving so fast around me, and I had no idea how to keep up. I started to feel the weight of my decision to leave Gloriavale. I had escaped the abuse, yes, but I also left behind everything I had ever known. I couldn't stop thinking about my family, my parents, my siblings, everyone who was still stuck in that place. I wondered if they even knew I was gone. Did they care? Were they being punished because I left? The guilt gnawed at me every night, but I knew I couldn't go back. I had chosen my path, and there was no turning around. After about a month of living on the streets, I ended up in a homeless shelter. I don't even remember how I got there, honestly. I think I just walked in one night, desperate for warmth and safety. The people who ran the shelter were kind, kinder than anyone I had met since leaving Gloriavale. They didn't ask too many questions, just gave me a bed and a hot meal, which was more than I had hoped for. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't alone. At the shelter, I started to meet other people who had their own stories of hardship. Some had lost their homes, others were escaping abusive relationships, and some, like me, had been cast out by their families or communities. It didn't make my situation any easier, but it did make me realize that I wasn't the only one struggling to rebuild my life. It helped, in a strange way, to know that I wasn't the only one lost in this chaotic world. But even in the shelter, things were tough. There was only so much they could do to help. I needed a way to support myself, but with no education and no work experience, I was at the bottom of the barrel when it came to finding a job. Every interview I went to ended in rejection. Employers didn't care about my past or what I had been through. They wanted people with qualifications and skills, and I had neither. I started doing odd jobs around town, cleaning, moving boxes, anything I could get my hands on. The pay was terrible, and it wasn't enough to live on, but it kept me going. Eventually, I landed a part-time job in construction, and while it wasn't much, it was a start. The work was brutal. I'd come home exhausted with blisters on my hands and aches all over my body, but at least I was working. It gave me a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. During this time, I tried to push Gloriavale out of my mind. I didn't want to think about the leaders, or the abuse, or the life I had left behind. But no matter how hard I tried, the memories kept creeping back. Every time I saw a family together, laughing and happy, I'd think of mine. I'd wonder what they were doing, if they missed me, if they even thought about me at all. The guilt was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, making me question if I had done the right thing by leaving. One night, I couldn't sleep. The thoughts were swirling around in my head, and no matter how hard I tried to block them out, they wouldn't go away. So I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I prayed. It felt strange at first, like I was betraying myself by turning to the very thing I had tried to escape. But I wasn't praying for forgiveness or guidance. I was praying for my family. I prayed that they were safe, that they weren't being punished because of me, that maybe one day we'd be reunited. As the months went by, I started to rebuild my life little by little. The construction job became full-time, and I eventually moved into a small apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time, I had a place I could call home, even if it was just a run-down studio with leaky pipes and drafty windows. I started studying in my spare time, trying to catch up on the education I never got in Gloriavale. It was tough. I had to teach myself basic things like math and reading comprehension, but I was determined to make something of myself. The work helped keep my mind busy, but the trauma from Gloriavale never really left me. I'd have nightmares where I was back there, being dragged into one of the punishment rooms, the leaders towering over me, telling me I was worthless. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, convinced for a moment that I was still trapped in that place. Those nights were the hardest. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever really be free of Gloriavale. Sure, I had escaped physically, but mentally I was still haunted by everything I had endured. And then there was the trust issue. After spending my whole life in a place where people were either brainwashed or outright abusive, I found it hard to trust anyone. I kept everyone at arm's length, even the people who had helped me when I was at my lowest. I didn't want to get close to anyone because I was afraid they'd hurt me, or worse, betray me like the leaders had. It was a lonely existence, but it felt safer that way. As I slowly built up my life, I found myself thinking more and more about my family. I didn't know if they were still in Gloriavale, or if they had left, or if they even knew where I was. I wanted to reach out to them, to let them know that I was okay, but I was terrified of what might happen if I did. What if the leaders found out? What if they punished my family because of me? What if my parents didn't even want to hear from me? The fear of rejection, of causing them more harm, kept me from making contact, so I stayed silent. There were times when I thought about going back, about trying to rescue my family from Gloriavale, but deep down, I knew it wasn't possible. The leaders were too powerful, the control too strong. Even if I went back, there was no guarantee that my family would want to leave with me. I'd seen it happen before, people who escaped, only to be lured back by promises of forgiveness and redemption. I couldn't risk it. I had to protect myself, even if it meant leaving my family behind. Even though I had started to rebuild my life, there was always that feeling of unfinished business when it came to my family. Every now and then, I would see something that reminded me of them. Maybe a father and son walking down the street, or a group of siblings laughing together, and it would hit me like a ton of bricks. The pain of not knowing what had become of them, and the guilt for leaving them behind, gnawed at me constantly. There were days when I just wanted to pick up the phone and try to call them, but I knew that it wasn't that simple. Gloriavale kept a tight grip on its members, and contacting someone who had left was seen as a betrayal. My family might not even have access to a phone, and if they did, who's to say they wouldn't be watched while using it? If the leaders found out I was trying to reach out, it could mean more punishment for them. And yet, the need for closure kept growing stronger. I started looking up news articles about Gloriavale online, hoping to find some mention of my family or any updates on the community. There wasn't much. Most of the articles focused on the cult's abuse and control tactics, which I was all too familiar with. But there was nothing specific about my family. The more I searched, the more frustrated I became. It felt like my past was slipping further and further away, and I was powerless to do anything about it. Around that time, I began seeing a therapist. I knew I needed to talk to someone about what I had been through, but opening up wasn't easy. I had spent so many years keeping everything bottled up, afraid that no one would understand, or that they would judge me. But the therapist was patient, and little by little, I began to share my story. The abuse, the fear, the isolation. It all came pouring out. It was the first time I had spoken about Gloriavale to someone who wasn't part of it, and it felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Still, therapy didn't erase the memories. The nightmares continued. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. In these dreams, I was back in Gloriavale, being dragged into one of the punishment rooms, or worse, standing in front of the leaders, completely exposed as they hurled accusations at me. It felt so real, like I had never truly escaped. Even when I was awake, the memories haunted me. Sometimes, I'd be walking down the street, and I'd hear a voice that reminded me of one of the leaders, or I'd see someone who looked like one of the other kids from Gloriavale, and my stomach would drop. There was also this underlying feeling of shame that I couldn't shake. I knew rationally that none of what happened in Gloriavale was my fault, but part of me still felt like I had failed. I had left my family behind. I hadn't been strong enough to protect them or get them out. And even though I knew that going back was impossible, the guilt was overwhelming. As I continued working and going to therapy, I found myself at a crossroads. Part of me wanted to move on completely, to forget about Gloriavale and focus on the new life I was building. But another part of me couldn't let go. I had this deep need for closure, for some kind of resolution, but I didn't know how to find it. A few months later, I made a decision. I had saved up some money, and I decided to hire a private investigator to look into my family's situation. It felt like a long shot, but I had to know if they were still in Gloriavale, or if they had managed to escape. The investigator didn't promise much. Gloriavale was known for being closed off and secretive, and getting information out of there wasn't easy. But he agreed to take the case. The waiting was torture. Every day, I wondered what the investigator might find. Was my family still trapped in that place? Were they even alive? Or had they moved on without me? I had so many questions, and I knew that the answers might not be what I wanted to hear, but I was ready for anything. At least I thought I was. Finally, after weeks of waiting, the investigator called me with news. My heart was pounding as I answered the phone, not knowing what to expect. He told me that he had managed to find out some information, but it wasn't much. My parents were still in Gloriavale, as were most of my siblings. They hadn't left, and as far as anyone knew, they hadn't tried to. It was both a relief and a crushing blow. I was glad to know they were alive, but knowing that they were still trapped in that place was devastating. The investigator also told me something else. Apparently, my parents had been told that I was living a sinful life outside of Gloriavale, that I had abandoned my faith and turned to the ways of the world. It was exactly the kind of thing the leaders would say to keep them from wanting to find me or reconnect. I felt sick to my stomach, knowing that they probably saw me as some kind of traitor when all I had ever wanted was to escape the abuse. When the investigator told me that my family had been fed lies about me, it hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the fact that they were still stuck in Gloriavale, it was that they probably thought I had abandoned them on purpose, that I had become everything the leaders warned us about. I wanted so badly to reach out to them, to explain what had really happened and why I left, but I knew it wasn't that simple. The leaders of Gloriavale were experts at control. They manipulated every aspect of the narrative inside those walls, making sure that anyone who left was seen as a lost cause, a sinner who had turned their back on God. My family had likely been told that I was living in sin, that I had rejected the faith and chosen a life of corruption. To them, I was probably as good as dead. The investigator advised me not to contact them directly, at least not yet. He said that trying to reach out could put them at risk of punishment, especially if the leaders found out. I hated the thought of putting them in danger, but the idea of leaving them there without trying to reconnect was unbearable. I was stuck in this horrible limbo, wanting to help them, but not knowing how. In the weeks that followed, I kept thinking about what the investigator had said. My family believed I had betrayed them, but the truth was, I had been the one betrayed by Gloriavale. The leaders had manipulated us for years, brainwashing us into thinking that the outside world was evil and that leaving would condemn us to hell. I had seen through the lies, but my family hadn't, and now they were trapped in a life of fear and control. One night, I decided to write a letter to my parents. I knew there was no guarantee they'd ever see it, but I had to try. I poured my heart out, telling them everything, how I had left because I couldn't take the abuse anymore, how I had struggled to survive on the outside, how much I missed them and wished things could be different. I told them I hadn't abandoned them, that I still loved them, and that I hoped they'd understand why I had to leave. I didn't know how to get the letter to them, but the investigator said he could help. He had connections with people who had escaped Gloriavale and knew ways to get messages in and out. It wasn't foolproof, but it was the best chance I had. A few weeks later, I got a response. I couldn't believe it. My heart was racing as I opened the envelope, not knowing what to expect. It wasn't from my parents, though. It was from one of my younger siblings. They had managed to sneak a letter out, and the words inside broke my heart. My sibling told me that they missed me and that things had been hard since I left. The leaders had told my parents that I was lost, that I had chosen a life of sin, and that they should forget about me. But my sibling didn't believe it. They said they had always wondered what really happened to me and that they hoped I was okay. They also said that our parents were struggling, but they were too afraid to speak out or question what they were being told. Reading that letter was like a punch to the gut. I had always hoped that at least one of my siblings would see through the lies, but knowing they were suffering and scared, just like I had been, made me feel helpless. I wanted to go back and get them out, but I knew that was impossible. Gloriavale wasn't just a place, it was a fortress, and escaping wasn't easy. The letter also mentioned something that chilled me to the bone. Apparently, the leaders had started cracking down even harder on people who showed signs of rebellion. They were punishing anyone who questioned the rules or tried to contact the outside world. My sibling didn't say much about it, but I could read between the lines. Things were getting worse in Gloriavale, and I was terrified for my family's safety. At this point, I felt completely torn. On one hand, I had built a life for myself outside of Gloriavale. I had a job, an apartment, and some semblance of stability. But on the other hand, my family was still trapped, suffering under the same abuse and control that I had escaped from. I couldn't just forget about them, but I also knew that trying to go back would be dangerous for all of us. I started researching more about Gloriavale, trying to find stories of other people who had escaped. I read about families who had been torn apart, people who had left but never managed to reconnect with their loved ones. It was heartbreaking. It felt like no matter what I did, I would never be able to fully move on from the trauma of my past. As the days passed, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter from my sibling. I had hoped for some kind of closure, but all it did was reopen the wound. I wanted to protect them, to get them out of that horrible place, but I had no idea how. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how trapped we all were. Me and the outside world, burdened with guilt and trauma, and them stuck inside Gloriavale, living in fear and isolation. I started to spiral a bit after that. It felt like all the progress I had made since leaving was unraveling. The nightmares came back with a vengeance. Almost every night I'd dream of being dragged back into Gloriavale, forced to stand in front of the leaders as they condemned me for abandoning my family. In my dreams, they'd turn my family against me, making them believe I was a traitor, someone who deserved to be punished. The guilt was overwhelming. I had escaped, but at what cost? I had left my family behind to suffer, and now they were being fed lies about me. They probably thought I was living a sinful, selfish life, when in reality, I was just trying to survive. I kept replaying that thought in my head, how different my life could have been if I hadn't left, if I had stayed and tried to protect my family from the inside. But I knew that wasn't realistic. The control the leaders had over us was too strong. Staying would have destroyed me, just like it was destroying them. Despite all this, I kept pushing forward. I had to. The alternative, giving in to the despair and hopelessness, wasn't an option. I threw myself into my work, hoping that if I stayed busy enough, I wouldn't have time to dwell on the past. It helped to a degree. The physical labor of construction gave me something to focus on, something tangible I could control. But no matter how hard I worked, the memories of Gloriavale and the uncertainty about my family were always there, lurking in the back of my mind. One day, a coworker noticed that I wasn't myself. He asked if everything was okay, and for a split second, I considered opening up to him, telling him about my past. But I couldn't. How could I explain where I came from without sounding crazy? How could I make him understand what it was like to grow up in a cult, cut off from the rest of the world? I just shrugged it off, told him I was fine, and went back to work. But that moment stuck with me. It reminded me how isolated I still felt, even after all these years. I had built a new life, but I hadn't let anyone in. I was still living with the walls I had built to protect myself from getting hurt again. A few months later, something unexpected happened. I got another letter from my sibling. This time, it was more detailed. They told me that things had gotten worse in Gloriavale since I left. The leaders had become even more controlling, punishing people for the slightest sign of disobedience. They were cracking down on anyone who even hinted at wanting to leave, or who questioned their authority. But there was something else in the letter that surprised me. My sibling hinted that they were thinking about leaving. They didn't say it outright, probably out of fear that the letter would be intercepted, but I could read between the lines. They were scared, but they were also starting to see through the lies. It was the first glimmer of hope I had felt in a long time. My heart raced as I read those words. Could it really be possible? Could they escape, just like I had? But with that hope came a flood of fear. I knew how dangerous it was to leave Gloriavale. The leaders didn't let people go easily, and anyone who tried to escape faced severe punishment. My sibling would have to be incredibly careful, and even then, there was no guarantee they'd make it out. I immediately wrote back, telling them to be cautious, but letting them know that if they decided to leave, I'd be there to help. I couldn't go back into Gloriavale, but I could be there on the outside, ready to support them in any way I could. I didn't want to pressure them into making a decision they weren't ready for, but I also didn't want them to feel like they were alone. The waiting was unbearable. I checked the mailbox every day, hoping for another letter, some kind of sign that my sibling had made a decision. But weeks passed, and there was nothing. I started to worry that something had happened, that maybe the leaders had found out about the letters, or worse, that my sibling had been punished for trying to contact me. The anxiety gnawed at me constantly, making it hard to focus on anything else. Eventually, I realized I had to let go of the need for immediate answers. As much as I wanted to know what was happening, I couldn't control the situation. All I could do was be patient and hope that my sibling would find a way to escape when the time was right. In the meantime, I started reaching out to support groups for people who had left cults. I had never really talked to anyone who had gone through something similar to what I had experienced, and I figured it might help to connect with others who understood. The first few meetings were tough. I didn't want to share too much, afraid that my story would sound too extreme, too unbelievable. But as I listened to the other members talk about their experiences, I realized that I wasn't alone. There were so many others who had been manipulated, abused, and controlled by powerful groups, just like I had been. Their stories gave me a sense of validation that I hadn't felt in years. Update 2. I continued attending the support group, and it made a huge difference. Listening to others who had escaped their own versions of captivity, who had also left families behind, it all made me feel less alone. I wasn't the only one who had been manipulated, torn away from everything I had known. It made the isolation I had felt since leaving Gloriavale a little more bearable. But the thing that kept haunting me was my sibling. I couldn't shake the worry that something had happened to them. The silence was deafening. After weeks without any word, I started to fear the worst, that the leaders had found out about the letters, that they were being punished or worse. It was agonizing not knowing if they were okay or still trapped in that place. One day, after what felt like an eternity, I got another letter. My hands were shaking as I tore it open. Inside was a short but life-changing message. My sibling had escaped. They didn't give me many details, probably for safety reasons, but they had made it out. I couldn't believe it. The wave of relief that washed over me was indescribable. After years of worrying, they were free. But even with that good news, the reality was bittersweet. My sibling had escaped, but the rest of my family was still in Gloriavale, and as much as I wanted to, I knew there was nothing I could do to get them out. They were still under the control of the leaders, still believing the lies they were told about me and the outside world. In the months that followed, my sibling and I slowly began to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't easy. They were still processing the trauma of leaving Gloriavale, just like I had been when I first escaped. But we had something in common now. Our shared experience of breaking free from that oppressive life. We supported each other in ways that only people who had lived through that kind of manipulation could. It wasn't long before my sibling found a job and started building their own life, just like I had. Seeing them take those first steps toward independence filled me with a sense of pride and hope that I hadn't felt in years. It was proof that despite everything, we could survive and thrive outside of Gloriavale. But there was always that lingering sadness in the background, the knowledge that we had left our family behind and that they might never escape. I thought a lot about whether or not I should try to contact my parents again. Part of me wanted to, but I knew it wouldn't be safe for them. If the leaders found out, it could lead to severe consequences. And even if I did manage to get a message through, there was no guarantee that they would believe me. The brainwashing ran deep, and the fear of punishment was a powerful motivator for staying silent. As the years went on, I came to terms with the fact that my family might never leave Gloriavale. It was a hard truth to swallow, but I had to accept that I couldn't save them. All I could do was live my life and try to make peace with the choices I had made. There were days when the guilt would still creep in, when I would think about what might have been if I had stayed. But deep down, I knew that escaping was the only way I could survive. Staying would have broken me. Leaving was the hardest decision I ever made, but it was also the only decision that could have saved my life. The trauma of growing up in Gloriavale will always be with me. There are scars that will never fully heal, but I've learned to live with them. I've built a new life, one that I can be proud of, even if it's been filled with struggles, and having my sibling with me on the outside makes it all a little easier. In the end, I'll never know what the future holds for the rest of my family, but I've found peace in knowing that I did what I had to do to break free. I've learned that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that save you. For anyone reading this, if you're stuck in a situation where you feel like there's no way out, know that there is hope. It might take time, it might be painful, and you might lose people along the way, but there's always a way to break free. You don't have to stay trapped. You don't have to let fear control you. I'm living proof that you can survive and even thrive after escaping a place like Gloriavale. And no matter what happens, I'll always hold on to the hope that one day my family will find their way out too.